Good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are always excited to get to celebrate the work of our friends, and especially our academic colleagues from various local colleges and universities. And so it is a special treat to be here with Moon Charania, whose new book, Archive of Tongues, An Intimate History of Brownness, has just come out. She is joined tonight by Drs. Opal Moore and Wendy Simonds, who are colleagues and friends as well. I will introduce Dr. Opal Moore first. Dr. Opal Moore is the author of Lot's Daughters and text collaborator for Children of Middle Passage, a performance artwork conceived with visual artist Arturo Lindsay and jazz musician Joe Jennings. Moore, now retired from Spelman College, taught creative writing, African American literature, and co-created and taught the first women's studies seminar course on the radical Black feminist lesbian poet and writer Audre Lorde. She also developed the senior seminar on the prolific and transformative womanist writer Alice Walker. So welcome to Dr. Opal Moore. To the right is Dr. Wendy Simonds, who is a professor of gerontology and sociology at Georgia State University. She is the author of several books, including Hospital Land USA, Sociological Adventures in Medicalization, Abortion at Work, Ideology and Practice in a Feminist Clinic, Women and Self-Help Culture, Reading Between the Lines. She is also co-author of Laboring On, Birth and Transition in the United States, Centuries of Solace, Expressions of Maternal Grief in Popular Culture, and co-editor of Sex Matters, The Sexuality and Society Reader, which is now in its 5th edition. Dr. Simonds participated in research on the clinical trials of, I can never say this word, thank you, in the 1990s that led to home medication abortion. She is currently doing research on cultural representations of the sexuality of old people and working on a play about sexual harassment in academia. A fertile ground, no doubt. So welcome, Wendy Simonds. Thank you for being here. And the person of the hour is Moon. We are so happy to have you here. She is an associate professor in international studies at Spelman College and affiliate faculty in comparative women's studies. She is a feminist theorist who researches and publishes in the area of transnational feminism, queer of color critique, psychoanalysis, and postcolonial thought. She is the author of Will the Real Pakistani Women Please Stand Up? Empire, Visual Culture, and the Brown Female Body, and most recently the book we are celebrating tonight, Archive of Tongues, An Intimate History of Brownness, which is out now from Duke University Press. She has held fellowships at both Emory University, James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference, and the National Humanities Center. She has also recently been selected as a Fulbright specialist to develop gender, sexuality, and feminist studies programs across the global South. She's leading a new project on brownness and femicide. So I want to welcome again everyone who's physically here with us tonight and let you know that you can ask questions, and we would love that. So if you would like to ask a question when the time comes, I'll bring the microphone to you, even though it might seem silly in a room of this size. It's so that the people who are watching at home can hear you, and so we can get a good recording on our tape. And for folks who are watching virtually, if you want to put your question in the chat, we will make sure that it gets vocalized and heard. So thank you again to everyone for being here. We're going to begin with a reading from Moon. So without further ado, please put your hands together for an Archive of Tongues.
Thank you, ER, and thank you to everybody at Charis for curating this beautiful feminist space that we all hold so near and dear to us. And I want to express my warmest gratitude to both of my interlocutors, Opal Moore and Wendy Simonds, for reading with me and thinking with me, and to all of you for being here this evening. So like ER mentioned, I think to begin our dialogue, I'm going to read a very short passage, maybe about 10 or 12 minutes from the introduction, which I think sets the tone for the book and perhaps allows us to get at some of the questions that have come up in our in preparing for this evening. So I'm reading from the introduction. It's called A Story on Tongues. I think I have to put on my glasses. Okay. Okay. When I was a little girl, my mother used to tell me a story. It was a story she repeated at various points throughout my childhood and well into my young adulthood. It was a strange, silly, and over-the-top story. Like many of my mother's story, the story was abject and centered around flesh. And for a long time, I thought the story was yet another example of my mother's obsession with oppression. But my mother narrated the story with such mysteriousness, seriousness, with such dailiness, continuity, factuality, steadiness, that I eventually came to hold space for the story in my life. That I eventually realized that my growing was marked by the story. The story was about the tongue. Think about the human tongue, my mother would say. The tongue is soft and vulnerable, fleshy and pink. We need it to eat, to speak. We need it to enjoy food and sex. The tongue is all muscle and no bone, supple. It has a huge range of motion and shape and agility. No matter how much you use it or don't, it never loses its volume. The tongue, she would say, is tirelessly flexible. But this tongue, for all its softness, lives between 32 teeth, hard, strong, dense, and sharp. Any given second, the teeth can damage, tear, wound the tongue. But the tongue has no choice. It must learn to live among the teeth, between and within the hardness that could individually or collectively destroy the tongue. My mother does not remember the origins of the story, unsure if it came from her mother or her grandmother, or a story she strung together from other stories she had heard throughout her life. But every time she offered the story, it was an invitation to think with her about difficulty and violence and unlivability, to think with her about the ways that women are often, quote, imprisoned by the peculiarities of the body, Simone de Beauvoir. The very idea of the tongue living so intimately with that which can destroy it functions as a necrometaphorization, a metaphor not just of death, but of death worlds, a metaphor of a life that is perpetually threatened with or close to death. But just as she inextricably enmeshed the tongue in a field of imminent violences, her story also pointed to the ways the tongue ruptures these possibilities and is instead perpetually surviving, resisting, maneuvering, negotiating, flitting, and fleeing its oppressive conditions. The tongue, as my mother tells it, insists on and survives through its agility. This private metaphoric story of the tongue's place in the mouth among teeth was one moment when I realized that my mother speaks in tongues. As the primer of my childhood, I now take this story into serious consideration. This strange little story, a play on words, a play on tongues, holds within it what Shayla Sandoval might call a methodology of the oppressed, an alternative consciousness, an oppositional expression. For as long as I can remember, my mother constructed the tongue in this way, as experimental, always tentative, subversive, possibly insubordinate, and unsovereign, never belonging just to itself. For her, the tongue is a troubled condition born in the body, both the closure of flesh in the mouth and a going beyond flesh, language. As a piece of flesh that functions in a structure of constraints, enclosures, governance, and training, the tongue has to survive its own conditions in order to then tell the story of its survival. This story offered a lesson on the non-sovereignty of our bodies, a lesson that violence was not just out in the world, exterior, anterior, posterior, but that violence haunts the very way our bodies are built. The irony of the body to commit violence against itself, and the ability of the body to survive and thrive, by which I mean to live intentionally, within its own inflicted or imminent violence, was not lost on me. Even as a little girl, I realized the story on the tongue undid the common sense of the body, taught to me in schools run by men, in books written by men. Over time, the story became for me an object of theory, an episteme in formation, not in the sense of theoretical distillation, but rather as implicitly theoretical in its inquisitive commitments and its descriptive style. I came to see my mother's tongue as having inherited incommensurable ways of knowing the unknowable, incommensurable because they unraveled conventional modes of empiricism, logic, comfort, and fact. I came to see my mother's tongue as a relation to a condition, a maneuvered sociality, a denied pedagogy. It is a pedagogy that is not pedagogical because it is rife with bad education, feminine insurgency, and indices of failure. It is a pedagogy of how to exist once you accept that oppression is immovable, a social fact of social life. It is a pedagogy that refuses to do with language in its more colonial guises is often called on to do. It is a pedagogy that renders oppression allegorized through the fleshy pink tongue among hard teeth, carnal, sexual, arbitrary, ideological, quotidian, and spectacle. Like so many of my mother's stories, this little story was messy, discursive, paratactic. On one hand, at least tautologically, it invoked an ideological desire to talk about power. In the story, both power, structural, and pleasure, libidinal, are bound up together. On the other hand, her expressions and enunciations on tongues only registered as scandalous, excessive, and unsavory. Certainly, there was something promiscuous within her line of thought, and that it was seen as promiscuous that always felt surprising, unknown, and accidental, something secret, hidden, worth searching for. The opacity of her words often arresting meaning. Riddled with riddles and moving with metaphor, my mother's stories often confounded me, puzzled me, frustrated me. I searched and searched for what was important about metaphors over and above candor, what was important about her opacities over and above transparencies. The tongue of which my mother speaks and the tongues through which I now write this book, are an archive of a feminized world that has been made abject and violated, evaded, or just not dealt with. Misogynistically dismissed, reduced to myth, folklore, old wives' tales, illiteracy, catty speech, gossip, riddles, conspiracy theories, paranoias, and secrets. Her broken, distorted, unfinished, feminized, lyrical, Urdu, Gujarati, Hindi, English vernacular, her ethnicized and gendered tongue pushes at the borderlands of formal and informal knowledge, of intellectual history and being left out of intellectual history, of useful knowledge, excuse me, of useful knowledge and knowledge without use, or not knowledge at all, extraneous, gratuitous, solipsistic. I am now a collector and curator of my mother's tongues, perhaps retrospectively, perhaps nostalgically. Stop right there.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. I have really enjoyed watching this book develop and hearing about it all along the way. So this is just a real pleasure. Okay, so I am going to ask a question that maybe sort of connects with that passage a little bit. But there's another part of the book where you write that your mother told you and her mother told her, the mother of a daughter is always a thief.
Mm-hmm.
And I kept thinking, what has she stolen and from whom? Is it that you don't write this, but I wonder what you think of this. Is it that she's stolen the opportunity of a son of continued patriarchal lineage from her husband? And because of you, I thought, not because of me, because of you, I thought, what would Freud say? How does this thieving mother of a daughter relate to the ideas of the daughter eating the father? Another anecdote in the story in one of the chapters. And how does it connect with racism, violence, feminine excess, and necropolitics, which you've just, I think, introduced?
Wow, thank you, Wendy.
She knew the questions in advance. So
I did.
She's acting.
I didn't realize they were all going to be asked together.
Well, you told me to combine these
Yes,
two.
I did.
Yeah.
Yes, you're right. I did. I think what I'll say is, what Wendy's alluding to is a particular chapter that's called Promiscuous Tongues. in which I explore a series of speech acts, not just by my mother, but by other Brown mothers, kind of, speech acts, what I call Brown maternal vernaculars that circulated in the homes in which I grew up. And many of them, they were deeply gendered. They were at first glance, they appeared to be very patriarchal. They appeared to be very ideologically trapped. They appear to gesture to power, but not necessarily to a way out of power. And so I wanted to do something, or at least sit and think about language. And I wanted to get to language because what I wanted to get at was sex, sexuality. I wanted to get at feminine excess. I wanted to get at necropolitics, sexual violence. These are very big themes in the book. But I didn't, we're all trained to be good Foucauldians. So I didn't want to go about it through this kind of, here's this moment of violence. And, I wanted to get at it in a way that would stay true to how these women spoke about violence, which was often through metaphor and analogy, and ciphers, through these kind of coded speech acts. One of which is the mother of a daughter is always a thief, gesturing to the ways in which raising a daughter in the particular context of South Asian coloniality, patriarchy, and also migration, immigration, and entering into white supremacist spaces, whether it's England or the US, which is the case for my mother, how that really punctuated for her, the differences in parenting a son versus parenting a daughter. And so that speech act really kind of emerges. So her mother said this to her. She said it to me when my daughter was born some 20 years ago. And I wanted to kind of think about that. Another speech act that that is introduced is also this idea of the daughter who eats, this kind of cannibalistic daughter who eats the father. And the context of this, which sounds, so the context is that you have my mother's brother-in-law died shortly after the birth of his daughter, who was his fourth child. And as soon as his passing occurred, within 7 days after the birth of the daughter, many what circulated within the home, this is in the 1960s, by the way, in Pakistan. So this is a particular moment also in Pakistan that I think understanding the kind of geopolitical histories, this moving away from kind of old school Islamo-ethnic cultural formations into a more kind of cosmopolitan, yet at the same time still holding on to some of those residues. This is in the 1960s. So this is, if you know those histories, it's pre Zulfikar Bhutto, who was coming in the 70s, who really kind of, full speed ahead brought about what we would call modernity in particularly Pakistan. So, that speech act followed the woman and the birth of her daughter in a way that I thought was really interesting, because on one hand, the material reality of the speech act meant that these women who were subjected to them were often surveilled in ways that were very punitive, very disciplining, sometimes even violent. But on the other hand, it allowed these women to make sense of a world that they did not create, in which they were existing, in which they were trying to find modes of disobedience. And whether it was this, the thieving mother or the cannibalistic daughter or the story on the tongue, what I came to realize is that language was these women's object, that their mode of disobedience, I won't use the word resistance or agency because I think there's different implications, and I'm not sure if these words work in general, much less in this particular context. But language was the object through which these women could understand, assemble, and mock also the world that they had inherited.
But what has she stolen and from whom? You didn't talk about Freud. Do you want to? I mean, he's your friend.
Oh dear. Okay, so this is a battle clearly that goes before tonight. Wendy's very cynical about my new. So I flirted with psychoanalysis for about 8 years, and I finally have just gotten into bed with it. So yes, Freud is big in a lot of. and I do in the book, I do an entire section on what does it mean to reject the psychoanalytic reading of the maternal. I think, the theft itself is about a number of things. I mean, I think at the very material level, it's really about money, and often within global South economies, gold. What women who don't participate in formal economies can exchange is often gold and other kinds of resources. So at the very material level, the saying is fundamentally about how did, women could exchange gold, sex, um, and other kinds of resources that they owned because they didn't have, they were completely subject to what I would call masculine or phallic economies. And that subjection to phallic and masculine economies traveled with them across borders, particularly in the case of my mother, but by no means was she alone. She was among other mothers like herself. But I think on the other hand, one of the things that I toy with in that particular chapter is also what does it mean to, steal your mother's sexuality because she couldn't actually have an active, interesting, meaningful sexuality, and not just, inherit it, steal it, but perhaps even whore in it. And this is coming out of a particular story of my mother's own love affair with a woman that never came to fruition.
And turned you into a lesbian.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, the lesbian curse.
So I want to try to fit into all the density that we've already jumped into and say that what fascinated me among many things in this book is that it returned me to a world where women actively talk to each other.
Yeah.
So this
Thank you.
book is really situated in the speech acts between women,
Yeah.
and in particular, your mother speaking to you, but also the importance of the way that you decided to listen. So I was really struck by that, and I wondered if we could just talk about that. I also was struck by the importance of story, that this wasn't the mother necessarily just saying, don't do this or do it that way.
No.
But when you were in deep talk, your mother would come forward with a story. In other words, she wouldn't just answer the question.
No.
She would come up with a story.
Mhm.
And so it made me think about the importance of stories as stories, but also what you say later in the work, that you wanted to figure out a way or rather, this was a way of studying how to think about thinking.
Mhm.
So I'd like to ask you something about that, about this dynamic of a women's culture that is demeaned as being not intellectual, not smart, not important.
Mhm.
And yet this seems to be the space where thinking is the goal of speech. Could you say a bit about that? And of course, you know where I'm heading here. So, but just this thinking about thinking, stories that are in the culture to be stories, not to be Aesop's fables where the moral is added on, where you're supposed to learn a lesson or something, but rather these are intellectual forays into
absolutely.
trouble.
Mhm.
Could you say something about that?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Opal. That's such a lovely framing. I think, I don't think the stories were didactic. I don't think that was their purpose. I don't think, and this is not to say that they couldn't be that or, weren't, because for the most part, I think, and I say this several times in the book that, my mother had an audience of one, which is myself, because others, children, other siblings, and then she had the audience of what in Urdu we call a zenana, which are women-only spaces. So many of the speech acts also referenced by Wendy, including the story on the tongue, were only spoken among and between women. And so the dynamic, the sociality that emerged when women were among women was just so stunningly different, so strikingly different than when women were among men. And I saw this my entire childhood, and I was always struck by it. But yeah, I think, one of the things I had to really think about with this book is, as a theorist, as someone who is, deeply attached to the critical canon, was, kind of trained in, Western critical theory, whether it's Freud or Foucault or Derrida. And I mean, I was deeply ensconced in this kind of critical lexicon. And how then what could I take these stories? My impulse was to say, here's the story and here's the theory, and find a way to amalgamate them. And I had a reviewer a few years ago who said to me, you need to let the story be the theory. You're trying too hard, is what she said to me too. And Wendy's also said this to me several times, actually, that, what do we do with these stories when they exist in their own space, and not try to merge them with kind of existing critical thought, or graft onto the speech acts and the words and the stories of brown immigrant women who are bound to the domestic, theories that are coming from, say, Judith Butler or whomever, right? Even if they are feminist theories, their theories are emerging out of particular material circumstances, material landscapes. And I think for, what I wanted to think about is, what is the epistemological opening in this story? Or in any of these stories, or in any of these speech acts. And I think that's what that's the kind of labor I had to do, is to just gather around, often uncomfortably, excessively, incessantly, and listen over and over. And I think this is that kind of, different pressure that we put on the project of critique and then the project of poetics. They're often seen as these very different, pulled apart, projects that are not really in conversation. There's the poet and there's a scholar. And these binaries didn't work for me in the context of this book, and in the context of my upbringing, in the context of my feminism. I had to find a way to say, if the language these women are using is, wrapped up in riddles and metaphors, and all sorts of ciphers, how then can this too be an opening that is not attached, or that is not just not attached, but actually antithetical to the kind of feminist training and theorizing that we've all been so not just ensconced in, but also deeply attached to, and that we reproduce in our own ways in our work. And so it meant for me to really go back to, I think, women of color feminisms like Toni Cade Bambara and Sherry Moraga and Gloria Anzaldúa, and to say, how do we take this language, this grammar that's emerging out of these material conditions, and think about them as a theoretical body, as an opening into thinking.
And if I may say, for me, that was the breakthrough of this work, that in fact the stories do operate as their own intelligence. And then we have to come to the story rather than having the moral or the meaning added on, like as has happened with other folklores. Right. Other internal stories have been externalized by changing them into something fixed. So if I could go just a little bit further, what difference does it make then that you have done this? I mean, in terms of the way that we approach and think about theory, as you say, as it is presented and studied and transmitted in the academy, what is the difference that these mothers' tongues, how does that break apart that structure, or even transform that strategy of understanding what words are saying to us, what stories are doing for us, what kinds of questions the questions generate.
Yeah, thank you for that, Opal. That was, by the way, not in the email.
I know, it's not. Yeah, I'm so undisciplined, you know.
Yes, touche. So, I think what I'll say is one of the hopes, I think, or goals or task of my project, and I think we see this in the world we live in, right? Which is we actually still don't really value feminine language, feminine grammars. We actually just don't value femininity. Femininity is seen as excessive, as bodily, enfleshment. It's tied to all sorts of stereotypifications that have been combated for so long, particularly, I think, by women of color and by, an entire world of femme lesbians. But I also, I think femininity remains abject. It remains tied to the body outside of that which is considered intelligent, useful, intellectual history. And that was one of the key things I wanted to disrupt, because most, in the context of, and this might take us, to perhaps another area of the book, but even in the context of this book, it was stunning to me, when I would tell people just among my own family, that I'm writing this book, and I would find whatever kinds of framings, necessary in that particular circumstance, how little value people in my own family and in my own community had put on, or saw my mother, much less mothers like my mother, as invaluable, as fundamentally anti-intellectual, unthinking, not not just not theorizing, but also just not even worth theorizing about, right? So who is the feminist subject par excellence? Certainly not a figure like my mother, who, even in 2023 is continuing to say that the mother of a daughter is always a thief, right? These are seen as backward, they're seen as hackneyed, they're seen as, kind of useless, ideological, eyes closed ideological speech. So I think to disrupt this idea of feminine, brown feminine knowledge making, especially brown feminine knowledge making that is bound to the domestic, because I think, whether it's brownness or, kind of the race subject becomes a subject par excellence, is when they break the barriers, economic barriers, political barriers. And these were not women who had done these things, right? So they were even less worthy of any kind of attention, any kind of, just interest. They weren't interesting subjects. And so to really challenge that idea that that women who are bound to the domestic, the maid, the wife, the mother, the whore, that these are figures and women who are actually building knowledge. They're actually opening ways of thinking that are often not available to us because we are so trapped in particular liberal, modes of thinking that require a particular kind of subjectification. And these women are seen as outside of that subjectification.
Do you want to talk about doctors and whores or your dad?
Oh dear. I think we go to my dad.
Your dad.
Yeah. Unfortunately, fortunately.
All right. So your dad is a minor character in this book, but he has a profound impact on the main character, your mother, and I feel like also on you. Would you tell about the process of gathering these stories from your mother while your father repeatedly interrupted, thinking it was all about him? And can you talk about how your parents' relationship with each other has changed with his increasing frailty? Or maybe just even over time, because I feel like no one here knows their history, but I do.
Yeah, yeah.
Or some people might.
That's all the hard questions.
Yeah. So the book is 8 years in the making. I started writing the book in 2015. At the time, my first book had come out. And, my mother said to me, well, what are you going to write about now? And I said, well, I'd like to write about you. And she said, okay. That was her first response. Later, there's a kind of another story that maybe Opal will bring up, but her first response was just this, okay. Later, as the kind of process began, and my mom and I, you can't call this oral history, you can't call this interview, right? This is just life, and it's taking the kind of material, the raw material of life, and turning it into something that we might later call a book. My father, my parents lived together; they are together. One day kind of came upon us and basically, asked what we were speaking about. And, I said, well, I just very broadly framed it. I said, I'm going to write a story. I think I'm going to write a book on, mom, but really about immigrant women. I just had to kind of make it less about her. And so I framed it as generically and as vaguely as I possibly could. And within days, it was very clear that he had come to understand my writing project as a project about a kind of happy immigrant story, which included him. This trauma to triumph kind of narrative. And very quickly began participating in all of the conversations. And also my as aged as they are, their health, my mother's health has declined. My mother was actually already very sick and declining health in 2015 when I began writing this book, and my father's health declined very rapidly thereafter. I want to say in 2016. He's now in his final stages of cancer, and so that's one thing we're dealing with. But so it was something, I think to think about is how very quickly male narcissism entered this terrain of feminine knowledge production. So that was one space, because I really wanted to think with my mother about these kind of, not that, these things, yes, stories and aphorisms, but also, again, this, the fact that she could not enter into a kind of feminist subjectification. And I really wanted to do some work around that. And the entry of my father into the dispensing of stories, the exchange of stories, the conversations, the dialogues that happened over the course of years, it became very clear to me how, as a feminist theorist, that I had to develop a understanding of the paternal as an interruption, and rather than as a partnership or as a, I think a friend said, maybe you tell your father's story as an interlude. And I thought, goodness, the last thing my father is an interlude. And this is not just, I don't think him, I just think this is also how patriarchy works. Soft or mild or aggressive or violent, and its many myriad forms, patriarchy finds a way to make things about himself. And so it wasn't stunning that my father did it. It wasn't overly surprising, but it was still something I had to work through. And so one of the things I had to figure out in both the theorizing of, why my mother, other than just why not, but was also to start thinking about interruption as a mode of theorizing, domestic interruption, paternal interruption, cooking, children, life, illness. These are all modes of interruption that interrupt the work we're doing as writers, as thinkers, as theorists. The paternal was a tremendous one. Now, having said that, I also knew I couldn't write my mother's story without also, to a certain degree, writing my father's story. And I desperately wanted to be as fair and as ethical as I could. In that storytelling, it was very difficult. Maybe I have managed it. I don't know. but and certainly I think in recent months, since my father's very rapid decline, and entering into the active stages of dying, I keep revisiting these sections, and I think, have I done it? Have I done it justice? I don't.
think you have. I definitely think you have.
I think there's more.
I mean, there's always
Yeah,
more.
okay, so yeah, so granted, but I have to, so probably my thinking is less fair than the work that you've done, because as I was reading, I was actually invested in the women's story,
Absolutely.
perhaps because I think that's what language is hungry for.
Yeah, I agree.
It does seem that we've heard the patriarchal story,
Mhm.
and
So much.
so I felt as though I was relieved that what we learned about the father and other men was always in the context of the telling of women.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's an unfairness, just to put it in that way.
Thank you. Yeah.
But I do want to take this opportunity to ask you about the story that I was hoping you would also include, and that is the story of Parvati and the riddle.
Mm-hmm.
Could you do that? Could you include that? And then I think, I'm not sure what our time is, but
Yeah.
And open it up. Maybe.
yeah.
Yeah.
But I said to both both of you that I was reading this as a kind of poetics. If we think about poetry as not separate from other kinds of discourse, which of course we should never do, then I felt as though there was a poetics in operation in the way that you came to work through your mother's stories and put her tongue in your mouth, as you have said.
Yeah.
And so I just feel like that story was the clincher. I mean, I just think it does what you were telling us about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, thank you, Opal. I think actually, I'm just going to read that paragraph.
Okay,
I
sure.
think it will perhaps, rather than me summarizing it, I don't know if I could do it well. It's based on Hindu mythology, and I'm by no means a scholar of Hindu mythology or Hinduism. So this is the last chapter where it's titled "The Other End of the Tongue," so this is the very opening of the chapter. One day, shortly after I told my mother that I was writing this book, I went to visit her. She probed me about my project, curious and suspicious. Lacking the words to summarily describe my intent, I described the book as part love letter, part feminist anguish, part critical theory, part history, part myth, part archive, part seduction, part me, part her. After a few moments of silence, my mother responded by relating a popular Hindu myth. In her version, Parvati, the mother of Hindu gods Skanda and Ganesh, ordered both of her sons to go around the world in a race. Parvati promised the fruit of knowledge, a mango, to whichever son circled the world the fastest. Skanda immediately jumped on his magic peacock and flew all around the world, returning home pleased with himself, ready to report his triumph and to receive the fruit of knowledge. But he quickly realized that his younger brother Ganesh had beaten him. Without leaving the room, Ganesh had circled around his mother and said, "You are my world." Ganesh was awarded the mango. However, when Ganesh excitedly bit into his prized fruit of knowledge, off broke one of his tusks. And I'll stop there.
It'd be weird if his tongue came out.
Thank you.
So I think, I opened with that. I opened this chapter. So this chapter is really an exploration of my mother's body. That illness is the natural horizon of women who live in patriarchal economies, particularly women of color. under Western medical industrial complexes, masculine domination, and white supremacy, they will eventually get sick and they will die from those illnesses. And I wanted to think about what my mother was doing here, that, you know, when I kind of give her my poetic spiel on what this book might be, she answers me with a story that is almost, you know, a threat, as much as it is also perhaps a promise, a revelation that, you know, you seek knowledge, something inside of you will be destroyed, will be broken, and will be irreparable. And perhaps it was, you know, her own poetic justice to think about all of the ways that she sought to create knowledge through the language she had available to her, and what that fundamentally, and the modes of disobedience that she and other women enacted in their life world, the ways in which it fundamentally broke not just their spirit, but their bodies. So, yeah, I think, I don't know if that.
No, I just want that on the record.
You still have both your tusks.
Yeah. I have my tongue. So maybe we'll open it.
Yeah.
Yes.
Questions or comments?
I'll bring the mic to you. Anyone?
I'll start.
Thank you.
Hey, babe. So you know, one of the things that I love about your mother is that every time we're with her, she drops another nugget on us. So my question for you is, you write about a lot of stories in your book. For me, my question to you is, what's your favorite story she's ever told you?
Ooh.
That's a hard question.
There's a lot of them, I understand.
You could pick more than one.
What? So one that was in the book?
No, just one that resonates with you. May or may not be.
One that
She's dropped a lot on us.
Yes, and Erin certainly has been privy to many of them. Sometimes, you know, if they're in Urdu, she doesn't always understand. But yeah, I mean, I think I'd have to return to the tongue story. How much it as a feminist scholar, I think that story just really allows me to get at something I'm working on in this new project on femininity, femicide, and brownness. And I don't think there's a more apt metaphor for femininity than the fleshy tongue. It's also obviously a metaphor for queerness. It's also a metaphor for that which is considered kind of dirty flesh. The tongue, interestingly enough, in Ayurveda is also seen as the site. It's a diagnostic site in Ayurveda. So the scraping of the tongue is how a diagnosis is made. And so, and it's usually the scraping of what they call these white particles. This is all also in the book. So I think, I know. Yeah, I think I would probably go to the tongue. I also, you know, have this really terrible rape joke in the book that people love this joke. I've said it. It's a terrible joke. I won't repeat it now.
I don't love the joke, but I love how you handle it in the book. I really think you do such a great job unpacking it.
Yeah. It was so tricky because, again, I think there's another story that I just heard over and over since I probably hit my teens that was a joke, also a story. And it took me quite a while to realize that it was a rape joke. And that it
Now, don't you want to hear it? Yeah. I mean, I kind of have to do it now.
Oh, dear. Okay. Okay, so I should just tell the joke?
Yeah, you can
Okay.
just tell the joke.
So the joke, as it goes, is a young man who lives in the city, kind of an urban fellow, wants to return to his small village town to get married, to find a wife. And so, you know, he comes back to the small town. He wants a nice, you know, fair-skinned virgin wife, not like the promiscuous girls of the city. So he returns home, and very quickly his marriage is arranged to this kind of lovely, doe-eyed, fair-skinned, virginal bride. And on their, I cannot believe I'm telling this joke and on camera. There,
You started it, right?
I'm going to blame Aaron, but yeah,
You
so
started it.
So on their wedding night, the groom, very excited to teach his wife the activity of sex, pulls out his penis and asks her, "Do you know what this is?" And she says, "Yeah, that's a mouse." By the way, the joke is actually originally in Urdu, so it's so she says that is a mouse, and he says, "No, no, no, sweetie, this is not a mouse. This is my penis." And she, in this kind of innocent sing-song voice, says, "No, no, that's a mouse." And so again, just still lovingly, but a little bit more firm, he's like, "No, no, darling, this is my penis." And she says, "No, this is a mouse. That's a mouse." And finally, just keeps repeatedly calling his penis a mouse. And so finally, very frustrated, with his bride's description of his penis as a mouse, says, "Why, what are you doing? Why do you keep calling my penis a mouse?" And so she says, "Well, what my uncle had was a penis. What you have is a mouse."
Erupting in laughter from all the women at the table.
Yes. So this story clearly is less funny in a feminist audience at a feminist bookstore. But the story, as it circulated among the women in my family, wearing their long maxis, sitting in the mosque, at home, on kitchen tables, in bedrooms, they would just absolutely, be filled with uproarious laughter and joy at this joke. And the zinger, of course, is the fact that the bride is not a virgin, that she very much knew what sex was, and probably against conditions that were not of her own will, with an uncle. And at the same time, she's able to symbolically castrate her husband, who was very invested in finding this kind of doe-eyed virgin bride, and teaching her the activity of sex. And instead, she is quite seasoned, if you will, in the activity of sex, whereas sex is also or always near violence. And so there was something about, I think, that particular joke, and many jokes like it. This was a genre of jokes. This was one of the more popular ones that circulated at every party, every dinner, every Eid, every event. There was always someone telling a joke of this nature. And it often involved, an uncle, and a virgin. I mean, this is kind of, so, and there was something I thought I need to figure out what is these women's deep intimacy with sexual violence, so much so that they had to develop a humor around it. And I don't think this is outside of the scope of, this is by no means just brown women, Black women, broadly have had to learn, have had to understand themselves as the butt of jokes, particularly jokes around rape and sexual violence. We've seen the failures of Me Too in the academy, Me Too at the national level. Rape jokes abound, and the use of the word rape, the way it travels into spaces that are fundamentally not about rape. So, favorite, not favorite, maybe. Yeah.
I love that part of the book because I really love how you tie it in with Patricia Williams' discussion of Tawana Brawley. And it really does show how people who are in oppressed positions take whatever power they can, however they can, even if it's a power of a dirty joke, right?
Absolutely. And, I think you said this to me, I remember a few years back, if we don't laugh, we die. And so they laughed.
Yeah, it also reminds me of an African American Southern joke about laughter, and Slim, who is a perpetual hero. He wants to laugh, but he can't laugh, so he's running around looking for a place to laugh, and finally he secretes himself into a phone booth and then he just breaks up laughing. And of course, the story is about the danger of laughter. So this examination of laughter and who owns it, actually, so that I think something happens when the women own the laughter.
Yeah, absolutely.
Something happens when the person who is not in power assumes that position of the laugher. So it did remind me of other ways that cultures talk about power.
Yeah.
But I said something, and I want to ask it. I wondered if you were aware of perhaps other cultures not having so many stories that introduce sex. Uh, is that something that you took for granted, or when you went to do the study, when you went to studying all of these relationships, was the prevalence of sex as one of the sites of knowledge, was that surprising? Because I said to you, it surprised me how much of the storytelling was about sex and sexuality, sexual violence, and so on.
Yeah, these are very open secrets. These women had very foul mouths. They were not demure or proper or respectable, even though they were wives and mothers. And in some ways, in various points in their lives had stability and mobility, which often are also markers of respectability and class, precarious though they may be, right? I, as a theorist of sexuality, I looked for sex. So I should just put that on the table. I looked for it and I found it everywhere. And so that was a joy. But
you weren't surprised.
But I wasn't surprised because, and I say this in the book that, sex suffused the space of my upbringing. These women, sex, the way it was, sex was the beast. Sex was also the way out of the beast. And even though they might not say that part aloud, but sex was definitely the beast. In every conversation, every joke, every event, my mother always said, girls are not safe in our house. And I grew up with that idea that, what it meant to be a feminine embodied person, what that meant for my comportment as a young girl and later as a young woman, and what it also meant for me in raising my own daughter among many of these same people, same family members, same kin. These relationships are still ongoing. And so, and it was also, I think, Opal, there was sex, sometimes in relation to pleasure and joy and curiosity, but more so it was sex in relation to flesh, abjection, and violence. And maybe, the jokes are warnings, right? It's open, because if it's not open, and so that was a very important, I think, part of all of the circulation of all these comments around sex, as they were warnings to the young girls.
Tongues among teeth.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. We have time for more questions or comments?
I have a question. I'm wondering if there were things that you found you couldn't include, not necessarily out of modesty, but like things that resisted the decontextualization that a book requires.
Thank you for that question. There are many things I didn't include. And throughout the writing process, I think I would come back to something and say, oh, this can maybe go here, or this can maybe I need to add more here. Am I doing enough? Are the stories enough? Are they doing the kind of work that I think they need to be doing, that I want them to do? Are they building a kind of repertoire with the reader? But yeah, I fundamentally made decisions to leave many stories out through a kind of very, if you know the work of Edward Glissant, who has talked about the colonized people's right to opacity, the right to not tell our stories, the right to not be naked and transparent to the person to the colonizer and to the colonial gaze. And this is so tricky because I tell so much and then there's so much I don't tell. And I grapple with this a little bit because I worried so much about producing my mother as an object that could be an object, a subject that could be taken up by just anybody. I worried that, did I just produce kind of another form of melancholic cannibalism where my mother is better devoured, swallowed, consumed rather than lost or disappeared? And so those decisions, I had to really figure out what I was going to leave, as I say in the book, on her tongue, and which I would fold out for the book.
I would really like to spend a lot of time talking to you because the whole time I was reading the book, I was thinking in Southern Black Christian spaces, you do not talk about sex.
Yeah.
You don't even talk about menstruation.
Yeah.
And when Alice Walker's The Color Purple came out, you especially don't talk about incest or familial. I mean, the community won't have it.
Yeah.
And so I'm really interested in talking about that huge difference. I mean, you cannot speak even in
among the women, Beverly.
yes.
Yeah, exactly.
You cannot.
So the disavowal is not across, it's among the women as well as across
period.
the genders.
Yeah, and you don't expose it is and I'm going to speak specifically about Southern
Yeah.
Black
Yeah.
Christian spaces, even sisters. I mean, even in familial,
Yeah.
you
No.
just cannot do it.
Yeah.
I mean, you will be run out.
Yeah.
Run out of the room. Run out.
And even if there is this, because I try not to overgeneralize,
Yeah.
but typically there may be discussions about sex, meaning that you don't do it,
Mhm.
right? You don't do it, or if
Period.
you do it, but there's not a lot of discussion about sexuality at all. And so, because I think about Kathy Cohen's work, and she talks about boundaries of Blackness, and so this opacity is really protection
Absolutely.
in some ways for a race,
Mhm.
because she was talking about HIV/AIDS.
Yeah.
But even just yesterday, I'm teaching a course on reproductive justice,
Mhm.
and I asked my students, how many of you actually had a talk about sex
Mhm.
with your parents? And maybe half of the room raised their heads. I have a large class.
Yeah.
And the other half said no. And one student said, my mother never talked to me about sex, but when I was unpacking my backpack, when I got to Spelman,
Mhm.
there were condoms in
Condoms,
it,
yeah.
but there was no discussion. So again, it's
Interesting.
just cultural
Yeah.
differences, which
And-
is really interesting.
Yeah, I know because Beverly and I have had this conversation for years now, and I do think there is, and I want to be a little careful because I don't want to chalk it up to culture. I think you'll find many South Asian families who don't talk about sex, much less sexual violence, much less incest. So I do think there was something peculiar about my mother and her mother. Now, her mother actually never talked about sex. My mother, I think there was something about this that wasn't, that the word or the framing of South Asian or diaspora or global South or Islam, Muslim, they were not going to capture this mode of storytelling. These were insufficient categories because so much of that interacted with the kind of family my mother married into, and which was a very scandalous family for a wide range of reasons, which I won't get into. But that meant it almost mandated that if we don't say something, there's zero protection. So Yeah, I think there was part of it. So again, I think, yes, I think there are serious differences. And also just thinking about Blackness and brownness intersubjectively together, but also as, both carrying very different genealogies of colonialism and white supremacy, and as well as migration. And Christianity,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I think Christianity.
Yeah, absolutely. And one would argue, I think, Uma Narayan, post-colonial scholar Uma Narayan, had this great phrase which circulated a lot in the late 80s and early 90s, death by culture, when she would talk about things like dowry or sati, or all of these kinds of scandalous ways in which South Asian women were killed or seen as killed by culture. And the term, I don't know, I thought it was a really smart term. I used it a lot during my MA and early graduate studies because I thought she captured something that just kind of, flatlined over time. But I also think, the religion is still deeply present in my home, as in this particular context as well. But I am curious about, the conversation around sex, not just for sexuality's sake, but as a kind of foreshadowing of danger, which, I think about, like, in terms of Black feminists, I think about Gail Jones, Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Gardens also, right? Like when she says we need to find our mother's stories bone by bone, I think that's her language. So we know, I think as feminists, we know what we're searching for when we're searching bone by bone. It is precisely all of these things that have just been buried so deep that we haven't even learned how to develop a language to speak about them.
Yeah. But also you and your family and a lot of the people, obviously I know a few more of the stories than other people, but it was also about a naming, right? It's like, it's understanding the fear and what all the women went through, but it's also putting a name to it, right?
Yeah.
So that talk of sex wasn't just about, the act of, but it was also the warning, right? So I think that's an important piece of it, that it's not just about the sex.
Yeah, I think that's an important point because, sex as a site of pleasure, as sexuality as an orientation, these things were off the table. These things were not, part of any kind of discursive terrain among the women, much less in co-gendered spaces. But yes, sex in relation to violence, threat, abjection, that was everywhere.
I think you see that in white Southern culture, but it's more related to class. So as the higher you get up on the class ladder, the more silent things become. But more working class white Southern people are more willing to acknowledge the dangers of reality because those are much more present, often much more immediate, even though the dangers exist in families of all class levels, right? But like the silence is so pervasive among white people at the upper echelons of class, and that's such a guiding value.
Yeah, and I think that makes me, one of the things I was thinking, Cynthia, when you were speaking, is that as South Asian brownness becomes more and more cosmopolitan, more and more kind of the what you would call the rising global middle class, the rising global elite, I think we're losing this kind of frankness, this kind of nakedness, this nudity around what we might need to teach, in the case of my book, daughters, but our children. Right?
It's interesting to me that you say that, because my Jewish grandmother came over from Belarus in 1919, and my mother used to talk about her talking about sex in an inappropriate way. So obviously there was something that she was way more comfortable in that space than when she entered this, white supremacist world that we live in over here.
You used a phrase, the telos of prosperity or something like that, the telos of the good life, that helps to suppress these kinds of stories that are considered inappropriate for mixed company.
Yeah, they're unsavory, and they also mark the model minority as maybe not so model. And that is that's really unforgivable for people who are striving for class, respectability, progress, modernity. And this was very immodern, very inappropriate, unsavory way to talk about sex. Yeah.
Well, we're actually at time. I want to thank you all so much for your deep engagement. And we have some just appreciative comments in the chat. So folks who are watching who are amening and clapping and thumbs upping. So I wanted you to hear that from them, although there were no questions. I want to let folks know who are watching with us virtually that you can buy Archive of Tongues by clicking this teal button at the bottom center of the screen. We really do appreciate you when you buy your books from Charis, so thank you. And there's folks have already bought their copies, which is great. Thank you for doing that. So we're going to say goodnight to you, virtual folks. We appreciate you joining us.